Welcome back to another episode of the AthElite podcast. We have a very special guest all the way from the USA today, Riley Ross.
Thank you for having me, Coach Solano. Appreciate it.
So, Riley, give us a little bit of a background because you've worked with some pretty special human beings in your experience. So, give us a bit of a background of what you've done.
Yeah, so background for me is as an athlete, typically what a lot of performance coaches and sports scientists realm is. I was a uh, athlete out of high school and college. I wrestled at the Division II level, and started to work myself into performance just as far as education, background, all those things, trying to get jobs, and actually ended up teaching as a professor at a college, teachers in exercise science. Then decided to start my own company, working with a lot of professional fighters, because the transfer from in the United States anyway, the transfer from wrestling to MMA is pretty easy. So I had a lot of connections within the wrestling world. And so a lot of those fighters, a lot of from the beginning and the onset, from Dan Severn to Randy Couture, all the way going up to Henry Cejudo and everybody from then on, the pedigree with wrestling, or the pedigree with MMA, is directly tied at the highest levels to wrestling. So I had a lot of connections within the mixed martial arts world, which led me to leaving, being at the collegiate level of teaching, and opening up my own facility in Southern California, and partnering with a place called Rain Training Center, which had the likes of Michael Bisping. Mark Munoz was the owner of that. And so we opened up a sports performance facility alongside of that. So it was a one-stop shop for training, for and all things mixed martial arts. So we had kickboxing, jiu-jitsu, every discipline that was available, we made available within our space and place. And we opened up that separate company called the Training Lab, which is TREIGNING Lab, which has became pretty renowned lately. Worked with TJ Dillashaw, athletes like that. So after I left there, we really started to kick up and to pick off from there. And I took another job working with the Department of Defense, and working specifically with Special Forces. And then after that, I've hence made my way up to The Ohio State University, which is one of probably the most renowned colleges in the nation. There's 36 sports. There's 1,600 student athletes. And I have an opportunity to be a sports science performance coach, kind of bridging the gap between strength conditioning and sports science, specifically working with wrestling and gymnastics. Those kind of fit in my wheelhouse, but assisting our coaches. We've got 21 strength coaches on staff. And so helping them integrate technology, velocity-based training, you name it, we probably have some frame or fashion of it within that realm. So that's been my journey over the last 15 years, believe it or not. It's covered a lot of different things. I've had the opportunity to just meet some incredible coaches along the way.
Yeah, that's quite impressive. Like being an MMA fan, working alongside guys like TJ, even former champs like Bisping. Um, that's really amazing, because you don't really, there's that. What would there be? Maybe 1% of the population work in the S&C field, and then maybe 1% of that, um, will be lucky enough to work in elite sports. So to have yourself in, not just working with one or two of those elite athletes, you work with multiples. So how did that all come along? Like, how did you necessarily attract those types of people, or get to be able to work with it? Was it internships? Was it, just good promoting? And what exactly got you into those fields?
I think there's lots of different avenues to get into those regions. For me, it just ended up being connections and networking, and just the athletes that I had, taking tremendous care of them, regardless of their their stature. I mean, I think all of us know when we get somebody special, and sometimes all it takes is one athlete. One of my first athletes, well, two of my first athletes were uh, Jake Ellenberger and Ryan Jensen. And Jake Ellenberger was a top 5 contender. Ryan Jensen was a top 10 contender, both in Omaha, Nebraska. And I just took really good care of them. This is before they really shot up the ranks and got really, really good. But they both had lost their first fights in the UFC. And so they just said, hey, I need some help. And I was just a professor at college who had a lot of background in training and had worked with some athletes, but never to the extent of that. And we just started kind of building. I started building a brand, and they started building their bodies towards what it is. And I think that it happened really organically from there. And so it's not usually, it's not necessarily right or wrong. It's just true or false. Sometimes you have these strength conditioning coaches who just know one person. Sometimes you hear stories of NBA or European soccer athletes who, had a buddy who's pretty smart in strength conditioning, but they were just elite in their sport. And so sometimes these elite athletes don't have the most elite strength coaches because they know a guy and it's their guy and they trust him more than they're willing to go out on a limb and work with somebody else that might be more qualified, might have more experience, and might be better. And so I didn't want to be one of those guys, coach. I wanted to be somebody who, even though I was inexperienced initially in how to get them ready for fights and how to prepare for those, I had done the majority of that work. I was really fortunate that I had worked in a weight management sport and had cut weight the wrong ways for a lot of times. And I think that's probably one of the most important things that anybody within combat sports or even within the tactical realm that I worked in understands. Just the grit and the grind that it goes through to make weight, to be dehydrated, even in austere conditions like tactical athletes are, and understanding what dehydration is, understanding what resilience looks like in the face of having somebody oppose their will on you in a very offensive and very adverse way. To have somebody literally try to hurt you or submit you or put you into the hospital or put you in a body bag. And so, I started working from there. Coach Shaleno is just getting better. And so the interesting thing that worked really, really well in my favor is I'd go to these fights with these athletes. And a lot of times when you go to these fights, there are the best of the best there. Sometimes you're fighting against them. Sometimes, you might have a dressing room that's got, I remember being in a dressing room with Anderson Silva when he did his famous kick, where I can't even remember who he knocked out right now with his flying kick. But I was in the locker room with him when that happened, I was in the locker room and he came in afterwards. And so I got to be around some of the best in striking and jiu-jitsu. And those coaches would come with those athletes to those fights. So, we'd fly in on a Sunday, leave on a Sunday. So I'd have 7 days where we're not training the athletes really hard. We're just getting them down to weight and making sure they feel good and getting their nutrition on point.
Yeah, it's interesting. Even with the weight cut side of things, like you saw Masvidal, fighting not that long ago against Usman and cutting 20 pounds in 6 days. Obviously, it was a late call up for the fight, but that's got to take some toll on your performance if you're cutting that much weight so close before a fight. And he's not the only one. You see Max Holloway, I think he was supposed to be a late fill-in against Khabib a few years ago, and he was walking around at 185 trying to cut to 155, and he's a 145er.
Yeah.
So in terms of the weight cut, how much do you think it actually affects performance? Because surely, being if done wrong and being in such a dehydrated state, you're more susceptible to getting knocked out, I'm assuming.
Yeah, there's the interesting thing about dehydration is it is, in order to do research on something, it has to be fairly safe. And so you typically can't get a research article done if you say you're going to dehydrate somebody to the level that these athletes are getting dehydrated. And you definitely can't put them in a situation or scenario where they have the opportunity to get knocked out. And so we don't know the effects. I would tell you from experience working in the tactical and the combat sectors that the 2% cognitive function, those things, I really don't believe that. I believe that as human beings, the way we were created is we are master adapters. And so I actually had a teammate of mine who's now a professor at my alma mater that had to go and actually almost write a mini thesis within his research when he was working for the Gatorade Sports Science Institute. That wrestlers, he wrote a mini thesis that wrestlers were professional dehydrators, just so he could dehydrate them to a level to see how he could rehydrate them. So I would tell you honestly that the typical person walking around, the statistics of 2% lose 2% after 2% dehydration, you lose cognitive function. Like, first of all, most people are not walking around fully hydrated, so that's a pretty tough one to monitor and to measure. But the other thing is, I would tell you from these athletes is they are consistently put in a place where they are called to adapt, and they are master adapters to just what is austere to most people.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting topic. I had a guy on the previous podcast talking about collegiate footballers and football players, and basically compare. He worked with football players and basketball players, and basically compared their adaptability to other sports. Um, and it's interesting because I've noticed that as well with wrestlers, how they adapt so well to MMA, whereas a boxer or a kickboxer, look at Gokhan Saki, for example, he didn't really have much of an MMA career, but you compare basically any wrestlers and, they just seem to pick up, and just dictate where the fight wants to go. If they want the fight on the ground, if they want to stand, if they want to fake a shot, shoot a takedown, but fake it on the ground and then come over the top with the overhand, similar to what Khabib did to Conor. They really dictate where the fight's going to be. And I think, before Cejudo retired, I think almost every champ except Adesanya had somewhat of a wrestling background. Stipe,
Right.
DC before Stipe, and then John Jones, and Adesanya's the only one that doesn't. And then you had Kamaru, who's he's just a phenomenal athlete.
Yeah. He's
So
actually from my alma mater. And so I had the opportunity to work with him, in a little stint, but knew of him really well. It's a small Division II college, but he's the pride and joy of the University of Nebraska Kearney, just with the wrestling team. He's the national champ there. But Coach Solano, I would tell you, it's not talked about a lot, but I would tell you, here's my, I ran into the same thing within the military. You've heard of an Army Ranger. I had a tactical athlete that I worked with that wrestled at a high Division I level until he decided to drop out and go to until he decided to go into the military. And he told me that Ranger school wasn't hard for him. And every other person that I talked to that wasn't a wrestler and didn't have a background said it was one of the worst things they've ever done.
there you
And
go. Yep.
What I would tell you, the interesting thing is that's different. Here's what's different about wrestling that separates you on I would say on a mental level. And here's what it is. It's the ability to just withstand somebody's physical oppression on you and knowing that you can't go anywhere, like you don't have an out. And so we talk kickboxing. So if you and I are going to kickbox, if we're sparring that day and you've got a fight coming up in a month, Coach Ross, I'm not going to go 100% on you. Why? Because I'll hurt you. And if I go 100% on you, what does that mean for me? You're going to, you can start, I've seen guys start out going 65, 70, and then boom, somebody gets hit and then it's 100. Well, if you have good training partners, that doesn't happen. If you're talking, kickboxing, boxing, football, anything like that, where your will is imposed on somebody, you cannot go live. You cannot scrimmage, even in rugby, you don't do that all the time because there's the potential to get hurt and injured. You get hurt or the other. So there's this like psychological, like, it's kind of like when people tell a lie, like somebody goes somewhere to a party and they lie about, oh yeah, we drank 7 beers, and the other one's like, well, we only drank 3, but I'm part of this story too, so I'll go along with the 7. It's the same thing. Like when we're training, as long as I don't go to a 10 and you don't go to a 10, we train pretty hard, but it's still safe, right? You know I'm not going to hit you as hard as I can. Well, when you get in a cage with somebody and it's you're going 100 and they're going 100, it's this heightened sense of anxiety and fear that you never feel at any other time. The difference with wrestling is every single day at some point in a practice, somebody is trying to take you out of your comfort zone, put you on your back with their face, their genitalia, whatever it takes to get on top of you and to get you in a position where you go to your back and you say, I give up. And so when 2 people are going at 100% and there's not the opportunity to get hurt at a really high level, then you get this psychological advantage on people where you're used to being oppressed. I mean, most good wrestlers at some point got the living crap kicked out of them. Every Division I wrestler, when they come in as a freshman, as an 18-year-old compared to a 23-year-old, there's a massive difference. And so that psychological oppression on a person over the course, there's nothing, in my opinion, there's nothing harder for an 18 to 23-year-old to do by choice outside of going into the military than being a collegiate wrestler. And so you see Daniel Cormier actually went to the same hometown as me. He wrestled at junior college, and I've known Daniel since 1998. Daniel lived the life of wrestling for a long time. So when you see John Jones, beating him up, or you see these athletes and he comes back, you think of an athlete like Dan Henderson, who's, Randy Couture, all these greats, they took their beatings in the wrestling room first. And so a beating in MMA is not that big of a deal. It's literally not as bad because you can tap out, you can say I'm done, and there's an out for you. To whereas in wrestling, there's not an out. Like you are going to endure those kinds of beatings. And I talked to Randy Couture about that probably 10 years ago. I remember a conversation about this. And so I think that's where a lot of your kickboxers and your other athletes, they say they want, they work on their wrestling, but here's what they don't work on within their wrestling. They don't work on the fact that they'll do a couple practices, but that's it. Whereas when you watch wrestlers, a lot of times elite wrestlers, like you could ask Daniel Cormier or whoever, outside of when he's doing MMA sparring, he never, ever, ever even practices wrestling. Most boxers and kickboxers will still do 2 or 3, 2 or 3 days of, hey, I'm still going to hit the mitts. I'm still going to work on those things. So they're not really dedicated to wrestling the way that wrestlers are dedicated to the stand-up game. And it's because of that reason. I think probably one of the best examples is an athlete that's very close to you guys. That's probably one of my favorite fighters. He's an unknown that I believe is going to get known pretty soon. His name is Raja Shippen, and he's right there southeast of Melbourne. He was just a street kid, but incredible Muay Thai striker. His elbows are as vicious as anywhere. But we had a lot of high-level wrestlers in our training facility, and he just went in and started fighting pro right away and fought, I think, 7 or 8 times and lost 6 of those times to wrestlers. And he didn't understand, and he would honestly tell you he folded under the pressure of having somebody like a Khabib come and get on top of you. Even somebody like Conor McGregor felt what it felt like to have just to be oppressed. I mean, I keep using that word, but I can't think of a better word for somebody who's never been in that situation. It feels like you are being oppressed by a government entity, is being, being wet blanketed by an elite wrestler.
how much can you dedicate out of 100% is pure strength, and the other part, what would be actual, like the tactical and technical part of wrestling, like ankle picking and just technique?
Yeah, that's a great question. Let's switch gears to sports science a little bit, and one of the biggest challenges is it's really easy to measure. I've tried for 10 years to try to measure load, internal external load of combat sports, and in my opinion, it's impossible. Unless somebody puts a chip in somebody and can measure everything from an internal. Anything external you put on, whether it's a kind of a bro or a bra or something on the neck, or I tried to get devices where you can actually measure heart rate and measure those things. But when you're grabbing people, it's tough to do. And so from a physiological and anxiety level, you don't know how high heart rates go in the most intense times in sparring and things like that. And then if you think about a wrestling practice and I'm picking you up, Coach Chileno, let's say a lot of times a double leg. I will practice a double leg if I'm working on one, or a collegiate athlete probably hits, I don't know, in the course of a practice, they probably hit 100 double legs in one way, shape, or form. So you and I, let's say we both weigh 150 pounds. Well, I just picked up 150 pounds 100 times. And so to measure the mechanical load, that's why wrestlers, sambo, judo, they are some of the most strongest athletes on the planet, because the mechanical load that they've had to endure for as long as they've had to endure it to be successful, they have developed a strength that is within the connective tissue, it's within the fascia, and it's a lot of times it's not something that you even are able to see within a strength and conditioning perspective. Football and rugby are notorious for having athletes that are really, really strong and really, really strong in the weight room, but they have to do their work in the weight room in order to get an adaptation on the field.
Yeah, one of my favorite parts of a UFC fight was when Matt Hughes was getting the shit beaten out of him by Frank Trigg, and then he basically on his back had the strength, and Matt Hughes is just a phenomenal farmer boy, and he picks up Frank Trigg, runs across the other side of the octagon and finishes him. Like that kind of strength. That's almost, I did another podcast about genetics, but that's almost, you can't teach that. Like a lot of it would have to be genetic, but also it's not necessarily doing 3 sets of 10 on the bench press, or
Yeah.
3 sets of 5 on the deadlift. So it has to be sport specific, but the other part is genetically, some people will just never be able to be that strong. And it's a good way to be sport specifically strength rather than just in the gym for that sport anyway.
Yeah. It's my favorite fight of all time. It's so funny. We didn't rehearse this off air, but it's definitely, it's got to be one of my favorite fights of all time, just because of the grit and resilience that just like what we are talking about. Matt Hughes had been in a situation probably 1,000 times before where somebody was on top of him and he couldn't get away. And so you literally see him stand up, pull the rear naked choke off, throw him over his back, lift him up, pick him up, throw him all the way over to the other side of the cage and choke Frank Trigg out. And, those are the kinds of things where is he stronger? Is he in better shape? The biggest advantage is in between the ears. And Matt Hughes had just been to a worse place prior in order to make sure that he won that fight.
We've got a thing called the Australian Institute of Sports, the AIS. And then there's also every state, like Victoria, have their own Institute of Sport where that stuff happens, but it's not specialized in MMA, or there's no specialized in football. It's soccer, Australian football, cricket, netball, and I think it's really good. I'd love to see a UFC PI in Melbourne or in Sydney. They got a UFC gym in Sydney, but it's not a performance institute. It's literally just a gym where I don't know what they've done. They've got some royalties, I think, out of it. But I'd love to see a performance institute in Australia, because, the top two although we've got such a our population's not that high across the country. You look at numbers. You know, we've got the top two uh, best gates in UFC history. So you know,
Wow,
both UFC, Adesanya versus Whitaker was about 60,000, and then Ronda Rousey, Holly Holm was another 50,000. So, and that's just a couple of times they've came to Melbourne. So it's definitely a growing sport. I'd love to see a PI in Melbourne or in Sydney, because what will happen there as well is guys like the man you talked about before, giving him a shout out.
yeah,
The more chance for them to become optimal in their sport, more more fighters, you know, fighting in the UFC. You know, we've got between Australia, you can count New Zealand as Australia as well. We'll claim them all.
yeah,
Well, you know, Volkanovski, Adesanya, you know, Whitaker was a champ. You know, so we got a lot of guys, you know, up and coming. And you know, you compare this to 10 years ago, we didn't really have. We had a couple who might have been on the undercard or the early prelims, but now you know Australia's in sports science anyway, we're one of the world leaders.
yeah,
It's just a matter of, I think, if we can do more, you know, specialization in MMA, and get a PI here and get guys like Forrest Griffin, who's I think is the high performance manager in Vegas for that PI. You know, get guys like him to come do like these conferences and tours once COVID's done. But that'll be awesome because I'd love to see more guys from Australia fight in the UFC.
yeah. One of the initiatives that they have, and the reason they have in the places they do, is because it allows them to almost have a farm system of. So what they've done, even in Shanghai, is they have an event center at Shanghai, so they will hold amateur events there to almost like a minor leagues with baseball, or like a lower tier, club level for European soccer, where they now can see those athletes and be like, instead of going to these very separate entities where it's, in America it's with casinos and it's with Bellator and all these other fractions of MMA. Instead of having to go there, they just own the whole circuit. They own from the amateurs to the minor leagues to the major main card fights. That's the goal, is to grow that sport in that region. And so they've looked at the places where it makes the most sense and they have the most opportunities to almost like develop those from the beginning. Because here's the very interesting thing, and I'll give Raja Shippen a shout out again from there. He's there in Australia now. He's from Southern California, but most of your fighters, you take the Diaz brothers, no formal training in high school. Typically, they were just kids who got in trouble and fought. You take a Conor McGregor, he was a punk kid. You take a lot of these these fighters, a lot of times they don't even know how to structure training because they've never trained. They never, they weren't going to a club sport when they were 5 years old. They're from a rough family in a rough area, and they just fought. And so then eventually they figure out, hey, I like to fight. I get paid to fight. But then for me, even with Raja, when he was growing up, he had no background in this. He was a kid who liked to fight. And so he was really good at fighting. But when it was time for me to sit down and to say, hey, Raja, this day you need to train really hard. This day you need to not train hard. This day you need to take off. Like, he would just turn around and go spar every day because he loved to fight. And that's not conducive to having a great career. But what's funny now is I see him on Instagram. He's training at gyms there in Australia, and he's got a bike. He's doing all the things that I wanted him to do 7 or 8 years ago. He's doing now later on in his career, because if you can educate fighters, and that's the up and coming kids, is kids no kids during my era were saying at 14, I want to be a professional fighter, but now kids do. And so if they can get around a place that would have the education and just the pedagogy of having great coaches around them to be able to develop them and see a talent in them, and then say, hey, guess what? Like, you can do something, but you need to structure your life this way. You're going to have some phenoms at a young age that then they've essentially been training for MMA their whole lives. And Aaron Pico, that fights in Bellator now, he's probably one of the best examples because he's a high level wrestler,
Yep.
but he's a Golden Gloves champion. He was doing jujitsu at Rain Training Center at a young age. And so he had touched all those sports even before he had came out of high school. And that's pretty rare, but that's probably the next evolution of MMA is you'll see kids at a young age be proficient at probably one sport, but then start to become a mixed martial artist in a lot of other ways.
Been an absolute pleasure to speak to someone in the MMA world and the tactical world. Thank you very much once again, taking the time out to be on the podcast. And it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on.
Yeah, Coach Chileno, I really appreciate it. I wish you all the best of luck and best of faith in what you're doing and what you aspire to. If anybody needs to reach out and get in touch with me, Coach Chileno, feel free to share my email information. I'm not extremely active on social media, but that's how Coach Chileno and I found each other. So you can look me up there. And just want to say thanks for the opportunity and, keep aspiring to be great in where you're at and what you're doing despite the adversity that we're seeing right now, because there's going to be a separation between the good and the great in a pandemic like this. And listening to podcasts, getting more knowledge, gaining more insight is just important. So thanks for the opportunity to just lend back to people that, that did the same for me when I was young and hungry to learn.